Weak agnosticism, also known as soft or open agnosticism, is the idea that we don't know if there is a God, but that it's something we could find out in the future. This way of thinking first came about in the late 19th century, and it caught on with philosophers and scientists who were looking for a way to bridge the gap between theism and atheism. People who are weak agnostics like T.H. Huxley say that while there isn't enough evidence to prove or disprove the existence of God right now, future discoveries or revelations might provide clarity. For example, a weak agnostic might say, I don't know if God exists, but I'm open to the possibility of finding out someday. This allows for ongoing research and intellectual curiosity. Weak agnosticism is often used in academic settings where researchers maintain an open mind while investigating religious or metaphysical claims. It's particularly common in fields like philosophy of religion and theoretical physics, where the boundaries of human knowledge are constantly being explored and expanded. Strong agnosticism is the belief that it's impossible to know whether or not God exists. This way of thinking, which became popular in the mid-20th century, says that our human minds are just too limited to ever fully understand or prove that God exists. Those who believe this say that the idea of God is too big for us to understand, so we can't prove it one way or another. For instance, a strong agnostic might say, we can never know if God exists because the nature of God is beyond human comprehension. This way of thinking is often taken up by people who want to be humble when it comes to questions about the nature of reality. Strong agnosticism is especially common in academic philosophy and among scientists trying to understand the limits of human knowledge. It's often talked about in debates about knowledge and has influenced many areas, including theology and cognitive science, by challenging what we can know about the ultimate reality. Apathetic agnosticism is the view that God's existence is unknowable and irrelevant to our everyday lives. This view came about as religious debates lost their importance in modern society. Those who believe in this view say that whether or not there is a God doesn't affect how we make decisions or behave. It's pretty common in secular societies, especially among younger people who value empirical evidence over faith. This way of thinking affects how we approach ethics, politics, and social structures. It encourages a focus on secular governance based on what we can see and measure. It also helps us think about how faith fits into society and how people form their identities in a secular world. However, some people say that this kind of agnosticism could lead to a lack of moral standards and a sense of meaninglessness in life. It could also mean that some important cultural and philosophical traditions that are linked to religious ideas are overlooked. Some say it makes things too simple and could even lead to people losing interest in spirituality. Empirical agnosticism. Empirical agnosticism is the idea that we don't currently have enough evidence to prove or disprove the existence of God. This approach is based on scientific methodology and looks at data that can be observed in repeated experiments. Notable thinkers like Bertrand Russell have put forth this perspective. Empirical agnosticism is the idea that theological claims often don't fit with the rules of scientific inquiry. They point out that religious ideas don't have falsifiable hypotheses, so they can't be tested empirically. This way of thinking also affects fields like the cognitive science of religion, which looks at religious belief through an empirical lens. For example, Justin Barrett's research looks at the cognitive aspects of religious concepts, but it's important to remember that science is always growing, and even today, scientists are still trying to explain even a fraction of the universe. Epistemological agnosticism. Epistemological agnosticism is about understanding the limits of what we can know about God. This philosophical stance, which is based on epistemology, says that we can't really know what God is like because it's beyond our cognitive capabilities. Immanuel Kant's work, Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, set out some of the key arguments for this view. He said that our understanding is limited to the world we can experience. Modern philosophers like Anthony Kenny have built on these ideas. A 2023 Pew Research study found that 22% of Americans identify as spiritual but not religious, which could mean they have epistemological agnostic views. This is particularly noticeable among younger people. Neuroscientific research, such as studies on the default mode network by Marcus Reichel, suggests there are biological limits to what the human brain can do, which might back up arguments for epistemological agnosticism. Some people think this way of thinking might lead to a lack of new ideas. However, its supporters say it encourages humility in philosophical and theological discussions. Epistemological agnosticism is still having an impact on areas like cognitive science, philosophy of mind, and religious studies, prompting a rethink of what we know and don't know as humans. Pragmatic agnosticism. Pragmatic agnosticism is a way of thinking that looks at questions of divine existence in a practical way. William James set the stage for this way of thinking in his 1896 work of The Will to Believe, where he argued that belief can be justified by its practical consequences. This way of thinking became more popular in the 20th century. Influenced by philosophers like John Dewey, pragmatic agnostics are more interested in whether belief is useful to them than in whether it's true. For example, they might take part in religious activities for social or psychological reasons without necessarily claiming to know whether God exists. This approach has also had an impact on fields like psychology and sociology. Studies like Kenneth Pargament's work on religious coping 2001 look at the practical benefits of spiritual beliefs without getting into the nitty-gritty of their metaphysical truth. Some people think this way of thinking might make it harder to be honest with yourself. However, those who believe in it say it provides a practical middle ground in religious discourse. Temporal agnosticism. The idea of temporal agnosticism is that our understanding of whether or not God exists might change over time. This way of thinking, which emerged in the late 20th century, recognizes that our understanding and scientific progress are constantly evolving. Those who support this idea say that current limitations in knowledge or technology could be overcome, potentially revealing new insights about divine existence. New insights from developments in cosmology or quantum physics could potentially shed light on theological questions. This way of thinking is shaped by the philosophy of science, especially Thomas Kuhn's idea of paradigm shifts in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in 1962. It shows how ideas about the relationship between science and religion are changing. Temporal agnosticism is about keeping an open mind to metaphysical questions. It means you're open to the idea that future discoveries or experiences could change your stance on God's existence. People who aren't fans of this view say it could lead to a lack of commitment or indecision. However, its supporters say it encourages intellectual openness and flexibility when faced with new information. Philosophy agnosticism. The philosophy of agnosticism, which was first put forward by Rabbi Sherwin Wine in the 1960s, says that it's impossible to know whether God exists because there's no clear definition of what God is. This goes beyond agnosticism because it challenges the very premise of theistic debates. The thing is, before we can even start to talk about whether God exists or not, we need to have a clear, falsifiable definition of what we're talking about. They say that traditional definitions are often too vague or contradictory to be properly examined. This way of thinking is influenced by logical positivism and the verification principle put forward by philosophers like A.J. Ayer. It's all about using the right words in philosophical and theological discussions. Agnosticism has implications for religious studies, philosophy of religion, and even cognitive science. It prompts a reevaluation of how we conceptualize and discuss metaphysical entities. Some people say that agnosticism is too quick to dismiss religious experience and intuition. Those who support it say it encourages people to think carefully about what they believe about God and the nature of reality. Theistic agnosticism. Theistic agnosticism is when you believe in God, but also accept that it's impossible to prove that God exists. This approach brings together faith and intellectual humility, which emerged in late 20th century philosophical discussions. People who are theistic agnostics believe in God, but accept that human knowledge is limited when it comes to understanding the divine. They say that faith goes beyond what we can prove with evidence or logic. This way of thinking is influenced by existential philosophy, especially the idea of taking a leap of faith that was popularized by Kierkegaard. It's in line with how apophatic theology is interpreted, which is that God is beyond our understanding. Theistic agnostics often take part in religious activities while still being open to doubt. You can see this approach in the work of Christian thinkers like Paul Tillich and John Hick. People who aren't fans of this way of thinking say it doesn't make sense. Those who believe in this approach say it allows for a more detailed way of thinking about faith while still accepting both personal beliefs and the idea that there might be some things we just don't know. Theistic agnosticism is having an impact on religious discussions today. It encourages dialogue between believers and non-believers by emphasizing the fact that we all have doubts about ultimate truths. Atheistic agnosticism. People who are atheistic agnostics don't believe in God, but they accept that it's impossible to prove that God doesn't exist. They say that while there's evidence that points away from God, there's no way of knowing for sure. This way of thinking is influenced by empiricism and skepticism and draws on the ideas of thinkers like David Hume and Bertrand Russell. It's all about using evidence to make decisions while accepting that there are limits to what we can know for sure. Atheistic agnostics often support the idea of secular societies and scientific inquiry. They get involved in discussions about the nature of knowledge and belief. Some people think this view is too cautious. Those who support this view say it shows intellectual honesty and rigor in dealing with metaphysical questions. This way of thinking is becoming more popular in academic circles and among people who are interested in science. It is influencing discussions on religion, philosophy, and the nature of belief. Aesthetic agnosticism. Aesthetic agnosticism is about spiritual or transcendent experiences without claiming to know anything about what's really going on. This way of thinking, which emerged in the late 20th century, is all about the value of having subjective, aesthetically rich encounters with the numinous. People who follow this philosophy enjoy religious art, music, rituals, and mystical experiences because they have an emotional and psychological impact, even if they don't necessarily agree with the metaphysical truth claims that accompany them. They say that these experiences can be meaningful and transformative without you having to believe in specific doctrines or deities. This perspective draws on Romanticism and the philosophy of art, with ideas from thinkers like Friedrich Schleiermacher and William James. It's similar to some interpretations of religious naturalism and non-theistic spirituality. Aesthetic agnostics often explore different religious and cultural traditions, looking for beauty and insight without committing to any particular beliefs. You can see this approach in the work of writers like Karen Armstrong and Sam Harris's exploration of spirituality without religion. People who aren't fans of this approach say it makes religious truth claims seem unimportant. Those who support this view say it allows for a rich spiritual life without being constrained by dogma. Methodological agnosticism. Methodological agnosticism is a way of looking at religious studies that doesn't get bogged down in whether religious claims are true or false. It was developed in the mid-20th century with the aim of studying religion in an objective way without endorsing or rejecting any belief system. People who practice this approach look at religious phenomena as social and cultural constructs. They focus on functions and impacts rather than trying to prove or disprove the metaphysical validity of religion. They say that not making up your mind helps you to be more impartial when you're looking at things. This approach is influenced by phenomenology and anthropology and draws on the work of scholars like Ninian Smart and Peter Berger. It's about setting aside your own beliefs when you're looking at different traditions. Methodological agnostics often get involved in comparative religious studies. They try to understand beliefs from an insider's perspective while maintaining a scholarly distance. Some people say this approach could lead to moral relativism. Those in favor say it allows for a more detailed and complex study of different traditions. This approach has had a big impact on academic religious studies, anthropology of religion, and interfaith dialogue. It's helped to make religious diversity more inclusive.